True story. Picture a 12-year-old boy in Illinois on an autumn weekend in 1932. The Dill Brothers Circus is in town. One of the performers is Mr. Electrico. He sits in an electric chair. A stagehand pulls a switch and he is charged with 50,000 volts of pure electricity. Lightning flashes in his eyes and his hair stands on end. The young 12-year-old boy has to go to a funeral of one of his favourite uncles. Driving back from the graveyard with his family, he looks down the hill towards the shoreline of Lake Michigan and he sees the tents and the flags of the carnival, and he says to his father, "Stop the car." And the father says, "What do you mean?" You can imagine. The boy says, "I have to get out." Obviously, his father is furious. He expects him to stay and mourn with the family, but despite this, the boy gets out of the car anyway and runs down the hill towards the carnival. 77 years later, the boy will think of this moment and realise that as he ran down that hill, he was literally running away from death and towards life. When he got to the bottom of the hill, Mr. Electrico was sitting on a platform out in front of the carnival. The boy was scared of making a fool of himself. He had a magic trick in his pocket, one of those little ball and vase tricks, a little container that had a ball in it that you make disappear and reappear. So he got that out and he asked, "Can you show me how to do this?" It was the right thing to do. It made a connection. Mr. Electrico knew now that he was talking to a young magician. So he took the trick and showed the boy how to do it, gave it back to him. And then he looked the boy in the eye and he said, "Would you like to meet those strange people in that tent over there?" The boy replied, Yes, sir, yes, I would." So Mr. Electrico led the boy over there to the strange people. He hit the tent with his cane and he said, "Clean up your language." He took the boy in, and the first person he met was the illustrated man. Isn't that wonderful? He called himself the Tattoo Man, but the boy would later change his name for his book. He also met the strong man, the fat lady, the trapeze people, the dwarf, and the skeleton man. They would all become characters in his books. Mr. Electrico was a beautiful man because he knew that he had a weird little kid here who was 12 years old and who wanted lots of things from the world. And as they walked together that evening along the shore of Lake Michigan, Mr. Electrico treated the boy like a grown-up. The boy talked his big philosophies and Mr. Electrico talked his little ones. All of a sudden, Mr. Electrico leaned over to the boy and he said, "I'm glad you're back in my life." The boy said, "What do you mean? I don't know you." And Mr. Electrico said, "Yes, you were my best friend outside of Paris in 1918. You were wounded in the Battle of the Argonne Forest, and you died in my arms outside there 22 years ago. I'm glad you're back in the world. You have a different face, a different name, but the soul shining out of your face is the same as my friend. Welcome back." Now, why did he say that? Explain that. Maybe he had a dead son. Maybe he had no sons. Maybe he was lonely. Who knows? Or maybe he saw something in a child's eyes that needed to hear that. Every once in a while at a book signing, that boy, now 77 years older, he sees a young boy or a girl that's so full of fire in their eyes that it shines out of their face. And he pays attention to that. When the boy left the carnival that day, he stood by the carousel and he watched the horses running around and around to the music of a song called Beautiful Ohio. And he cried. Tears streamed down his cheeks. He knew something important had happened to him that day because of Mr. Electrico. He felt changed. Mr. Electrico gave him importance, immortality, a mystical gift. His life was turned around completely. It made him cold all over to think about it later, but he went home and within days he started to write. And he continued to write for his whole life. That boy was famed science fiction writer Ray Bradbury, and he would go on to write more than 50 books in his lifetime. Books including Fahrenheit 451, The Illustrated Man, Dandelion Wine, and Something Wicked This Way Comes. He would write scripts for shows like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, as well as movie adaptations, like most famously Moby Dick. Bradbury died in 2012 at the age of 91, 2 years after the interview recounting his meeting with Mr. Electrico. But even then, the memory of Mr. Electrico remained clear in his mind. In that interview, Ray recalled Mr. Electrico's final gift to him. 77 years ago, and I've remembered it perfectly, I went back and saw him that night. He sat in the chair with his sword, and they pulled a switch, and his hair stood up. He reached out with his sword, and he touched everyone in the front row, boys and girls, men and women, with the electricity that sizzled from that sword. And when he came to me, he touched me on the brow, and on the nose, and on the chin. And he said to me in a whisper, "Live forever." And I decided to. I don't know about you, but I'm hopeful that by now Ray is perhaps somewhere new, alive again, keeping an eye out for old electric friends in passing circuses. Hello, I'm Max, and this is StressBall, the podcast to help you squeeze the stress out of your life. Today's episode is the second one ever. So, in the interest of keeping it light, we started with a story of a 12-year-old boy being groomed by a circus performer into believing that he was immortal. But don't panic just yet. Today's episode is about stories. Okay, look, we're just getting this podcast started here. This is the definition of a small, independent podcast. We don't have a team or a budget of any kind, so if you genuinely enjoyed today's podcast and you want to show your support, then probably the best thing you can do is tell a friend. The algorithm wouldn't say that, but I think the best thing you can do is recommend it to a friend, and maybe other people like you can enjoy it too. That seems like the most important thing. The other stuff is more of a pain in the ass, but if you're willing to do it, maybe rate it, review the podcast on your app. That'd be super helpful too. If you just do one of those things, just know that we're super grateful. That's amazing. Thank you. Also, look, hey, as I said, we're independent. So if you just love the podcast and you'd love to give, who am I to stop you? Feel free to show your love financially. There's a Patreon set up to help you do that. Because due to capitalism, my family needs legal tender to help pay for goods and services. Or if you hate the show and you wouldn't do any of those things, tell me to go fuck myself by buying me a virtual pint or a Meta Americano by contributing to the Patreon. I'll know what it means. Or if you don't want to do any of that, that's fine too. I hope you enjoy the show today. What is a story? In our last episode, we touched upon a theory proposed by Robin Dunbar. He related the human use of language to the large social group sizes we self-organise and cooperate in. And if you haven't listened to that, I'd urge you to go back and have a quick listen now, because while not required, it might prove useful for today's episode. You see, Dunbar's theory is rooted in an assumption about people and their brains. Namely, that our brains have evolved in the way that they have in order to help us function and survive and replicate in our environment. An assumption you might know as evolution. To achieve these goals, we have had to evolve to function successfully both in the immediate physical environment that surrounds us and in the immediate social environment of the other humans in our tribe that surround us. And to achieve that, we have made use of tools. And as I say tools, you're probably thinking straight away of cavemen with rocks, flint axes, the wheel, and PlayStation 5s, I don't know. But I would urge you instead just to take a step back and think first of the tool that comes before all others. Specifically, the tool that helps shape our uniquely human brains. our capacity for story. Today, that's what we're going to talk about. While our DNA contains the instructions to build the hardware of our bodies, stories are our software. While our DNA evolved slowly over hundreds of thousands of years to confer benefits and behaviours that best suit our environment, stories are tools that allow for much faster adaptation. Believing certain stories of bravery and loyalty, for example, can modify our behaviour drastically, which in turn can confer great benefits to the groups that we are a part of, our tribes. Stories motivate us to take action. Stories allow us to work together and cooperate towards dreamt of goals. They are the ideologies that can keep peace or start wars. They are the histories that allow us to recount past events to others. Characters in stories allow us to consider different points of view of the same event, allowing us to see the world through very different eyes. Stories can be the counterfactuals that allow us to imagine situations that have not even happened and may not ever happen. The what-ifs that have come before many great insights. In short, stories help us to learn. They help us to understand. To do this, they operate at multiple levels. Countries have them in the form of, among other things, constitutions and currencies. Freedom of speech exists because it's an agreed story, as does the dollar. Companies have them. They call them mission statements and visions. Google wants to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, for example. Other groups have them in the norms of behavior that they agree on. These are the group reinforcing stories of people like us do things like this. Even individuals have endless stories that help them form their identities. I am a great and worthy manager of people. Or I am struggling with fertility issues and may never have a child. Or I am a loving mother. Or I am a crafty political animal. I am stuck and I cannot see a way out. I am a mushroom shaman who dances wine-drunk and naked in the lush green forest. I could go on, but that last one sounds like the winner. And anyway, you get the idea. Human stories are unique in that they allow us to delay the gratification of our biological neural reward systems through time into some promised imagined future, sometimes even waiting until after we die. The latter is the story of many religions, the promise being that your reward in heaven will be great. So be good now, lads, and do what we say. That seems to work well on us because of our brains, but you could never convince a monkey to give you a banana now by promising him unlimited bananas in heaven. You'll notice none of these stories are the movies or fictional novels or songs of our popular culture, but make no mistake, what we're talking about here, they're all still stories. We're just so used to them that they may not seem like stories at all, but no matter how real they appear, they're still fictions to one degree or another. It's just that they are fictions that many of us have agreed upon, fictions that in some respect seem to work well, and in other ways, if you've ever looked at the news, may have one or two flaws. Let me break down the types of story more for you here to make what I'm saying a little bit clearer. Firstly, and obviously, stories are the movies and books and music and politics, the big stories of our popular culture. These are the creative, outward-facing stories that have their roots in Dunbar's gossiping human tribes and how large groups seek to organise around shared stories. Secondly, there's another type of story. It's the constant running story in each and every person's mind. The story that is required before we can even begin to tell any outward-facing stories. This is the internal story that in quiet moments occupies our minds in the attempt to answer one question: who am I? This second type of story is the story of your own personal identity. Each individual must construct this story of identity over their lifetime because this particular fiction allows the individual to relate to other members of the group. This fiction allows us to compare and contrast identities with others. This story holds the information about what behaviour is appropriate for you given your role and status within a group. It gives you a perspective from which to relate to other social animals. As Archimedes once said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I will move the world." Identity is such a fulcrum. It is the pivot point around which we attempt to move everything else we come across in our lives. What does that mean? We'll come to that. But first, I want to introduce the third type of story. The third, and arguably most fundamental type of story, is the story that each of us tells about the information that we encounter in the world around us as we go about our lives. The story we infer is one of cause and effect. It's a bee stinging you on the arm, you feeling the pain and concluding that maybe it would be a good idea for someone else in the tribe to go collect honey from the hives next time. Even more simply, it's the story that bees can inflict pain by stinging. Cause and effect. X happens and causes Y. Rain happens and I get wet and cold. It can be as simple and ancient as this, or it can be a story about PayPal changing its strategy away from customer acquisition in the last quarter, and that negatively impacting the stock price in this quarter. This cause and effect type story is the way humans process the fundamental information of the world. So, to recap, the core idea here is that evolution gave us stories, and once it discovered their power, it used them as much as possible. Reuse, recycle, repurpose. Evolution does not like waste. Each time, the same tool with the same basic shape is being used over and over again, and that tool is story. To really help us understand story as well as we can, let's reverse the order that we discuss these topics in today. Instead of starting with our big fictions, let's start from the ground up. Give us a steady base. Firstly, let's look at the role of story in our basic perception of the cause and effect in the physical world around us. Let's call this section With Surprise in Mind. It's part 1 today. Then secondly, let's look at the role of story in our perception of ourselves in building our identities. This will be part 2 today. Let's call it A Hero on a Journey. And then that still leaves the whole area of how stories help us create our perception of other humans and our large human cultural narratives. So that's still to look at, but there's already a lot to talk about in the first 2 sections, so we'll save that for another day and focus on parts 1 and 2 for now. Now, when we started this episode saying we were going to talk about stories, your mind probably went straight to Star Wars, The Godfather, Die Hard maybe. Understandably. I promise we will get to at least one of those today. But first, I am asking you to think about stories differently. Not just as cultural artifacts. Yes, they are those too, but I will show you that they are not just those things. They are not just trilogy George Lucas movies about young space samurais finding their fathers in space. Nor are they trilogy Francis Ford Coppola movies about young godfathers replacing their fathers as godfathers. Nor are they 5 Die Hard movies about a father who just cannot trust any infrastructure around him anywhere. Yes, they are those too, but they are not just those stories. No, the first key point here today is that at the base level, at the level of cause and effect connection, stories are fundamentally about helping us to process the information that the world presents to us. This is part 1, with surprise in mind. And in this part, we're going to touch on evolution, film editing, dopamine, and a little bit on information theory. So let's go. As we've mentioned, most living creatures share the goals of survival and replication. For the most part, no matter our conscious preferences, our genes want us to live long enough to grow to maturity, find a mate, start a family, and then keep that child long enough for them to be able to survive on their own and repeat the process. If you're into that, so far so good, you might say. If you're not, so far so biological Ponzi scheme. But in terms of evolution and natural selection, the idea is that for animals to pass on their DNA, they must be well adapted to the environment, both physically and if they're social animals, then also socially. This ensures that DNA with adaptations that are a good fit to achieve those goals in the environment are more likely to get passed on, and ones that are not are less likely to get passed on. Most human stories start with a moment of unexpected change. Why is that? Something surprising happens in our environment, and that causes us to pay attention. As a child, when you first see a ball roll off a table, you think, what the hell just happened? Things fall down. Do they always do that? Why don't they ever fall up? Interesting. Hold my calls for the next few months. I need to be rolling balls off tables until I totally understand how this works. As children, we instinctively want to experiment with the new thing, to literally grapple with it until we feel we understand it and can really rely on what we've learned. Hilariously, we mostly do this in early life by ramming the object of fascination directly into our mouths for a good gnaw, immediately terrifying our parents that we're about to choke ourselves to death. Why do we do this? The mouthing thing, I honestly don't know. My best guess is that terrifying parents is never not funny. The focusing on the surprise and experimenting with it thing, well, as a species, we desperately need to understand the world around us so that we can learn to control it enough to survive and to ultimately replicate, as we've covered. To do this, we need to build maps in our brains of cause and effect for the world outside our skulls, both physical and social. If I see this, it means this. If I do this, then this will probably happen. Hunger can be relieved with food, thirst with water, cold with heat, but fire burns, be careful. Oh, and James is not to be trusted, especially not with fire. We are obsessed with cause and effect. Let me give you a fun example. It's called the Kuleshov effect. In the 1920s, Russian filmmaker Lev Kuleshov demonstrated that the interaction of two sequential shots allowed the viewer to derive more meaning than a single shot alone. He demonstrated this by showing an initial shot of a bowl of soup, or a dead girl in a coffin, or a woman on a reclining couch, and then after each, cutting immediately to an actor's face. So, a bowl of soup, then an actor's face. Then dead girl in coffin, then actor's face again. Then woman reclining on couch, then actor's face again. This simple film was shown to audiences who then raved about the acting from the actor, the subtle nuance of his performance when reacting to the soup, or to the girl in the coffin, or to the woman on the divan. However, the reality was the exact same footage of the actor's expressionless face was used each time. What had actually happened was that the audience had simply imagined the meaning portrayed on the actor's face and projected a theory about the emotion underlying his expression from the context of the shot that came immediately beforehand. To such an extent, they actually perceived subtle differences in his expression that were simply not there. In the minds of the audience, pieces of information that existed in isolation were cobbled together into a story to create meaning. If A and B happen together, out of the gates, we have a default story about them that links them and what they mean. Our minds do this instinctively, and this is what shapes our lives. The rational cry of any statistician listening to this right now is that correlation does not equal causation. Just because two things appear to have a relationship or happen at the same time, in probability-wise, there's no guarantee they're actually linked. And that's why we have, randomized clinical control trials, or why we seek to avoid confounding variables in pharmaceutical studies, so that we can avoid arriving at beliefs in relationships that don't exist. And they're right about that. But about that, our instinctive brain does not give a single shit. In the words of famous ad man Rory Sutherland, the human brain does not run on logic any more than a horse runs on petrol. It runs on stories. Simple maps of cause and effect built in childhood lay the foundation for more complex maps as we reach adulthood. Maps upon maps of what causes lead to what effects, guesses layered upon guesses, some right, some wrong, stories upon stories. But how do we do this? The stories we encounter in the world expose us to complex feelings, all driven in part by a heady cocktail of neurotransmitters in our brains: empathy, oxytocin, laughter, endorphins, anxiety and fear, cortisol and adrenaline. But if there's any neurotransmitter that lies at the heart of a story, it's dopamine. When established patterns are broken or new information comes to light, it's the element of surprise that first captures our attention. This causes us to focus on the new information around us, and we're rewarded for building our stories of cause and effect. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter most associated with our reward system. It is the brain's tool for making us enjoy activities that are good for the survival of our genes. Part of the role of dopamine is to help the brain encode these cause and effect relationships about the world, which in turn helps create expectations for the future. And dopamine loves a good surprise. Neuroendocrinologist Dr. Robert Sapolsky speaks about fascinating behavioral studies using monkeys. A monkey is given a signal, usually a flashing light, that indicates an established known task is to be performed. In this case, a lever is to be pressed 10 times, after which the monkey will receive a reward in the form of a single raisin. What the studies show is that when the monkey is familiar with the task and the signal starting the task is shown, the dopamine rises massively in the brain of the monkey. It's like he's like, yes, I get to do the task that comes with a reward. Then it reduces to zero while the monkey actually does the work. And after the task, the reward of the raisin ends up triggering another, but this time smaller, dopamine burst. It's as if he's saying, yeah, I got a raisin, but I knew I would. It's better than nothing, I guess. This shows us one interesting aspect of dopamine, that it is not simply the pleasure neurotransmitter. It is the anticipation of pleasure neurotransmitter. Dopamine is about the pursuit of happiness rather than some kind of static, permanent happiness. As Sapolsky says, dopamine is about mastery and expectation and confidence. Dopamine says, I know how things work. This is going to be great. But dopamine is interestingly unfair because, as we've seen with our monkey dopamine experiment, dopamine rapidly habituates reward, meaning that when we know with certainty to expect a reward of a given size, we get way less dopamine than we did at first, when that very same reward was a surprise. In short, we get bored easily. We crave novelty. Unfortunately, we're not built to stay satisfied. How does that work? Well, if you get more of a reward than expected or get it sooner than expected, then you get a bigger burst of dopamine. If you get less of a reward than expected or have to wait longer, then there's a decrease in the size of the dopamine burst you get. And it's this prediction error, this surprise, that signals to the brain to adjust its expectations. It's to drive more anticipatory reward when things have gone unexpectedly well in the past, and less anticipatory reward when they've gone worse than expected. Or maybe even just about as well as expected, but for long enough to bore you. The point is, dopamine is rewarding, but only under the right conditions, and mostly when it's the result of a positive surprise. So, why are we talking about dopamine when we're here to talk about story? Because, as we've seen, dopamine relates to our sense of expectation, surprise, and control. And these are all key elements of the stories that we tell. That's not some crazy leap. At a fundamental level, the mechanisms of our neurology are focused on building cause and effect relationships in our mind. Building stories about what to expect, stories about how to predict the world around us and how it will behave, and what to do to get the rewards that we value. I'm going to talk about how this manifests in our fictional stories in a moment, but first I want to just drive the point home about the fundamental importance of surprise in information processing. Why am I talking about information processing all of a sudden when I was just on about dopamine? Because, just in case it's not clear yet, That's what these stories are. These cause and effect narratives are the way evolution decided was the most efficient way for our brains to process the flood of information coming their way in order to make sense of it, in order to allow us to build our maps of the world. More specifically, we're talking about information theory because it might tell us about why dopamine cares so much about surprises. The next 2 minutes are likely to be the driest of the episode, but I believe it's key to understanding story at this most fundamental level. So here we go. Information theory is a practical branch of mathematics dealing with coding and communicating information. As one of the great science writers of our time, James Gleick, says, it began as a bridge from mathematics to electrical engineering and from there to computing. Since then, even biology has become an information science, a subject of messages, instructions, and code. The body itself is an information processor. Memory resides not just in brains, but in every cell. DNA is the quintessential information molecule, an alphabet and a code, 6 billion bits to form a human being. Mathematician Claude Shannon is widely regarded as the father of information theory. He was primarily concerned with an engineering problem, the reliable transmission and receiving of information through a communication medium, a wire or a Wi-Fi signal, for example. Interestingly, the basic idea of Shannon's information theory is that the information value of a communicated message depends on the degree to which the content of the message is surprising. If information is not surprising, then it's necessarily already expected or known, so it isn't new information, so why pay attention to it? You already know it. Shannon's information theory is the theory upon which all modern communications, including the internet, are built. Interesting that a mathematician concerned with the optimal way to deal with communicating information equated surprise with information. It's almost like evolution figured out what it needed to do through trial and error before anyone was involved enough to bother to sit down and do the maths on it. Now, Shannon was careful to explicitly separate the concept of information from that of meaning. He focused on the journey of the information through the wire, not the meaning to be extracted from it once it got to the other end successfully. Wisely, he considered the hidden information of the decoding machinery in the human brain that would do this out of scope for his task. That's why he refused to comment on meaning, because that's where it's made, in the human brain. And as we know, it's made there with story. So, the role of surprise in our minds is to focus our attention, to call out, look over here, notice this, it's surprising, it might be useful information. That's the micro scale inside our skull. Let's just cheat a little bit and talk about the macro scale now, because, you know, I've got to give you something, and we're talking about the Godfather and Die Hard and all kinds of things, instead of dopamine and communication channels. Come on, you deserve a break. At the macro scale, we see this pattern played out in the fictional stories that we tell that capture our culture's attention. It's the off-balance of the normal world that occurs at the start of every story. In The Godfather, it's when Michael, the war hero, who normally distances himself from his family business, learns that his father has been shot. What? Dad's been shot? Is he okay? I need to be with him. The story starts in a zone of comfort, one of established routine, of almost boring certainty, being a dutiful war hero's son at a family wedding. The understandable routine is then rudely interrupted by the unexpected surprise, and the hero needs to struggle to establish control in an environment that's been put off balance. That is information. As viewers and readers and listeners to this story, that is surprising, and it sets off our dopamine prediction error detection, and we want to see how things play out. What the hell happens next? But once things are moving, how do the stories hold the interest of the audience? Too many unpredictable surprises, and the story is an unpredictable, chaotic mess that nobody can follow. Unless you're the writers of Lost, we can't just keep on making up mad, unrelated shit and hoping that the surprise alone is enough to keep everyone interested. Here is where writers use a trick: reincorporation. So, you know the whole Chekhov's gun thing? If you don't, it goes like this. Don't be having a gun lying around in Act 1 that doesn't go off in Act 3, you bollocks. It turns out, a big part of stories is like this. It uses the reincorporation of what has come before to create structure. Children come into the world knowing that the point of a story comes from reincorporation of earlier events. So says Keith Johnston, a pioneer in the world of dramatic improvisation, and who am I to argue? For example, why doesn't the wolf eat Little Red Riding Hood when he first meets her in the forest? Well, if we see him go to Granny's house and eat her first, we'll want to know what will happen when Little Red Riding Hood is brought back into the story. We have some expectation and curiosity. According to Johnston, this feeding back in creates structure. And in doing so, it also presents opportunities for surprise. It allows the writer to establish patterns. Famously in jokes, these are patterns of 3. Look no further than your classic casual racism of a Paddy Englishman, Paddy Scotsman, Paddy Irishman joke. Because 3 is the shortest sequence that allows, firstly, for the setting up of the scene of a story, secondly, to reinforce that reality, and then thirdly, to deliver a surprise that undercuts your established expectations. Here is a somewhat disturbing example from famous blues musician Leadbelly to illustrate the point. He said, "You take a knife, you use it to cut the bread, so you'll have strength to work. You use it to shave, so that you look nice for your lover. On discovering her with another, you use it to cut out her lying heart." The murderer says to himself, in justification, "The reason I was working so hard was to have the strength to buy her something nice. That's the reason I rose in the morning, and that's the reason I ate, to have the strength to go to work. That's the reason I shaved my face, to look nice for her. And when she betrayed me, I used the same knife to ensure she gave her love to no one else." Not exactly modern, up-to-date relationship advice, but it does demonstrate how reincorporating elements of a story and bringing them back in helps you to maintain the structure of the world you have built, to reinforce it, to help keep things believable, and also, every now and again, allow you to deliver a surprise and confound the expectations you have built, all with the aim of delivering those all-important dopamine hits that keep things interesting and exciting and give them meaning. So, that's part 1, with surprise in mind. Congratulations, you made it through part 1. The story of cause and effect. Stories exist to help us to create maps of the world around us in our minds, maps of cause and effect that allow us to learn how to exert control on that world in a bid to survive and to replicate, because the race must continue, god damn it. And in order to help us to continue to keep updating these stories, we have a dopamine response that values surprise above all else, because surprise is information. So where does the story of identity fit into this? Welcome to part 2, A Hero on a Journey. The second key point that we said we discussed today is one level up from the story of cause and effect. It is the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. The story of our identities and our lives. It is our constant attempt to answer that question, who am I? I'll let you in on the secret. You are a goddamn hero. I'll prove it to you. As we touched upon in episode 1 and discussed again today, our hallucinated and predicted story-based map of the world is all we really have. But there can be many ways to connect a cause and effect, and who says which connection is the right one? Do I feel sick because I ate that fuzzy strawberry at the back of the fridge, or is the problem that I didn't eat enough strawberries? Am I hungry? Or maybe the strawberries aren't the problem. Maybe it's anxiety that I'm feeling in my stomach about the masked intruder standing in my kitchen with a knife. It could be that. It's probably that. For humans, as natural story generators, it's all too easy to generate contradictory stories about the facts that we encounter. It's a bird. No, it's a plane. No, wait, it's Superman. No, the election was rigged. No, I'm probably having a psychotic episode again. The way we solve the problem of these contradictory meanings is by judging the value of the information that we encounter through the lens of our identity, from the point of view of the people that we are and the lives that we have led, the sum of our experience. That is to say, from within the confines of our already existing personal stories. We feel like we already know what's real, so we match any new stories we create to work with the stories that we already have. We already have stories created about the type of person we are. A good father, a loving husband, a killer of hitchhikers. A good father, a loving husband, leave it at that. Not the last one. Forget that last one. Whatever it is though, we subconsciously build a complex web of stories that come to support the overarching narrative of who we are. And we interpret the world from within that story. It helps give us our feeling of which new stories are right or wrong. And once it's built, many of us will do anything to keep that story alive. I am a dentist. I am an effective, efficient, competent, and necessary dentist. I care about teeth. I pursue dental excellence in every facet of my being. I am not a great conversationalist, but it doesn't matter how boring I am because I am a dentist and dentists matter. Is one possible story of identity someone might be telling themselves as we speak. And look, we don't want to unfairly stereotype anyone. A dentist being boring is actually a very good thing. Nobody wants to go to an exciting, risk-taking dentist. That said, in the interest of fairness, I do wish I could say I know some very exciting dentists just to balance that example. I really do wish I could say that. But we're just going to have to leave that there. So back to the story of who am I? Well, much like the Kuleshov effect, when it comes to our internal stories about ourselves, the events and interpretations that have come before in the stories of our lives thus far exert an influence on how we see what comes next. The story of you is woven together by the interpreter module of your brain, which we discussed in episode 1. And the brain subordinates every single fact that comes its way in order to help keep you in place as the hero of your story. It is a very biased storyteller. As I build my stories that map my reality, I become my story maps, and I am strongly, subconsciously motivated to see my point of view as correct. When I weave the story of myself, I cast myself as the hero, even if the rest of the world thinks I'm the villain. We all do. In a way, that's kind of a good thing. You need to believe in your heroic nature because the alternative can look a lot like depression. Ask people in any classroom or office to rate how intelligent they are, and the vast majority will rate themselves as above average, which, when you think about it, doesn't really work out numerically. In one study, 96% of Americans rated themselves as special. They can't all be right. Some people are being very kind to themselves. This hero-making bias that we have for ourselves is a big part of the difference between the first type of cause and effect story that we used to understand the physical world and this second story of identity, this type of story that we use to help us navigate the social world. When it comes to the stories of ourselves, we are the hero. Writer and researcher Will Storr points out that if we have mistakes in our model for the world, what you might call character flaws, which we all have to some degree, then they're not simply ideas of this and that which we can identify easily and just choose to shrug off. They're built right into our hallucinated models. He says, our flaws form part of our perception, and this makes them largely invisible to us, which is a problem because correcting our flaws would require us to at least see them first. That's hard to do when they're part of you. In fact, you probably see them as virtues. The problem, though, is that we all have some beliefs that we're wrong about. Believing otherwise, that you see the world totally, clearly and objectively, is known as naive realism, and it leads you to believe immediately that those who would disagree with you must be uninformed, irrational, biased, or some intoxicating mix of those options. The more deeply held our beliefs, the harder they are to update. And few stories are more deeply held than those that form our identity. Our minds are literally made up. Physical structures are in place that uphold the faults in the map of the world supporting who we are. As the old saying goes, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. This is the blind spot we all share. Despite this, even if our misjudged map of reality brings crisis to our lives and reality bites back, showing us our personal flaws, making our blind spot visible, still many people often refuse the call to change. Why? Because change can be deeply uncomfortable. Because it jeopardizes our role as the hero in our story. Instead, we often choose to double down in our tribes and echo chambers of belief to buttress and reinforce our status as the hero. We remain certain that our map of this world must be correct, despite the evidence to the contrary, because, well, it's served us well up till now, or even if it hasn't, at least it's kept us alive, and it sure is familiar and comfortable. I'll let you in on a secret. The last time someone told me that putting all that ketchup on my chips was disgusting, I told them to go fuck themselves, because emptying full bottles of ketchup in one sitting, well, that's just what heroes do. See, your somewhat faulty map of reality kind of feels like home. It's part of you, of the foundation of the story of who you are. And changing core parts of ourselves can feel a lot like dying, because when we change, structures are being pulled down and rebuilt in our brain. In a very real sense, part of us is dying. So we care about our identities and defend them at all costs, but they are still just deeply ingrained fictions. It might be useful to consider that the cold hard facts of our lives could be put together very differently by another author who is not us. Now, at the risk of sounding like a self-help guru, if you're someone who isn't very kind to themselves about themselves, it might just be helpful to try to consider the option of telling parts of your story of yourself differently. That option is there. Maybe you're not always awful. Maybe it's just Tuesdays and Wednesdays between the hours of 2 and 6. Maybe you're actually quite good at certain things, but you find it hard to see. Even that already feels like a much more manageable story. But I digress. The point is that the tool of story is reused, repurposed by evolution to make us self-aware, to construct an identity. That's the micro scale, internal to us and our minds. But how do we see this reflected in the macro, outside world of fictional stories that are told by humans? There are many macro lenses through which we can view story structure in fiction. And if it's interesting to people, we can talk about them at length another time. But for today, I want to make use of one of the most widely used story templates in modern Western storytelling culture, the hero's journey, as laid out by Joseph Campbell in his famous book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Now, there are 17 steps in the original template laid out by Campbell. But don't worry, we're not going to talk about each one in detail today. If you remember nothing else about the hero's journey, just remember this. At the heart of it, at the heart of the hero's journey, it simply says one thing. In the face of a constantly changing world, you need to be willing to change. And you do that by learning how to learn. Technically, that's two things. I'll grant you that. But that's the essence of it. It's essentially what the theory of evolution would say if it had a mouth. Now, in part 1 in our previous discussion of cause and effect, you've already seen the first step of Campbell's journey, the call to adventure. But interestingly, in Campbell's template, this call to adventure, this initial destabilizing surprise, is followed by step 2, the refusal of the call. The hero in the call to adventure is shown the limitations of their world, but this introduction to a larger world of possibilities and this call to adventure is generally followed by this stage of rejection, where the hero just refuses to deal with it. It doesn't want to acknowledge the change, doesn't want to take on the discomfort of embarking on this journey. And that's step 2 in Campbell's template. In Star Wars, it's when Obi-Wan Kenobi says to Luke, "You must learn the ways of the Force if you're to come with me to Alderaan." And Luke responds, "I can't get involved. I've got work to do. It's not like I like the Empire. I hate it, but there's nothing I can do about it right now. It's such a long way from here." Any more excuses you want to throw in there, Luke? You pulled a muscle. You can't quite. It just doesn't feel right. Something's off. You got a paper due Monday. Jesus Christ, Luke, stop being such a whining little dick. We all want to scream that at the screen because instinctively we all know what is required. As the hero's initial worldview is challenged, the hero themselves must take up the challenge and change to adapt. That's what heroes do. That's what evolution values. So that's what human stories value. The first lesson of the hero's journey is that when we're confronted with the information that conflicts with our model for the world, the heroic character ultimately accepts the call to adventure, to undergo the painful process of challenge that leads us to the lessons we didn't know we needed to learn, and that ultimately allows us to update our core beliefs, destroy our old limited selves, and through this process, grow. It is the wrongness of our models that causes the initial drama. So the first key lesson of the hero's journey is that heroes are willing to change. As Joseph Campbell himself puts it, it is by going down into the abyss that we recover the treasure of life. Where you stumble, there lies your treasure. The very cave you were afraid to enter turns out to be the source of what you were looking for. The damn thing in the cave that was so dreaded has become the center. You find the jewel and it draws you off. In loving the spiritual, you cannot despise the earthly. As the hero pushes beyond the naive realism of their worldview, their facade appears to drop away. And as they first reveal and then tackle their character flaw, they evolve to become better versions of themselves. Through facing what we fear, we grow. Through testing in the face of opposition, often of our worst fears, we're forced to drop the worldview that doesn't serve us and find an approach that works. If we really want to be heroic, we're forced to evolve our beliefs and ideas. If we're willing to do the work, we can create a better identity. Think about your own life. Isn't drama really only possible when people come to a situation with very different internal stories about what it means? And when they communicate then poorly about their different perspectives, certain that they are 100% right and the other person is 100% wrong. One of the many lessons of story is that drama gets no oxygen when people are authentic with each other about their stories and then curiously engage with each other to try to understand the other person's world. In the words of famous playwright David Mamet, the subject of drama is the lie. At the end of drama, the truth. Or, evolution might add, at least something closer to the truth than what we started out with. So, what does the hero's journey tell us about this quest to forge a new identity? Well, it tells us that we don't know everything and to be open to change, as we've said. For our purposes, we're not going to go into each of the 17 steps, so let's just look at the general shape of the hero's journey to see what it reflects about our constructed stories of self. The hero's journey consists of 3 stages. The journey starts as any journey would, with the departure stage, and it ends as any journey would with the return stage. And in the middle, there's what Campbell calls the initiation stage. If it helps you to picture it, the journey is often visually represented on a circle like a clock face, where the hero travels from their starting point in the normal world at 12 o'clock on the clock, and going clockwise through the initial stages of the departure until around 3 or 4 o'clock they cross into the unknown underworld of the second stage, the initiation. And then at 9 o'clock, returning again to complete the return stages there. In much of mythology, it's a literal journey to the underworld, but in modern storytelling, the shape can be applied to almost any adventure. But if that's hard to follow, don't worry, because the key to unlocking the hero's journey is simple. Just think of it as a quest for knowledge. At its simplest, it's starting from a place of no knowledge, then going on to experiment with things, and then ending up in a place of learned knowledge. That's it. Depart as a dumbass, do some experiments, return knowing how shit works. Departure, initiation, return. The hero's journey says, change is the one constant there is, so learn how to deal with it, and in doing so, forge your identity. To prove the point now, we'll step through the 5-act structure most commonly associated with modern movies, with examples taken from The Godfather. In the interest of trying to keep it short, we'll keep the examples to just this one movie, but rest assured, other examples exist for each of these stages in Star Wars and Die Hard and in many other movies besides. I'm just going to assume that everyone alive has seen The Godfather. Now, I'm probably wrong about that for some of you, so just a quick spoiler alert, we will be stepping through some key plot points shortly. But more importantly, if you haven't seen The Godfather, stop listening to this podcast and go watch The Godfather. You'll thank me, and I will still be here when you're done. We start in Act 1. In the normal world, in the departure phase of Campbell's model, where the hero lives in a zone of comfort and with no knowledge of any problem. The hero is then surprised out of his complacency of the everyday existence by this inciting incident. They're forced to pay attention to the new, earth-shattering event that has occurred. And this gives them awareness of a problem, the call to adventure. We've already covered how this looks in The Godfather. An attempt has been made on Michael's father's life. Then, at the start of Act 2, still in the departure stage of the journey, the hero refuses to acknowledge the problem. Because, come on, who likes problems? Fucking nobody. That's who. During this act, the hero turns this around and does slowly start to acknowledge that there is a problem and eventually commits to solving it. And that marks the end of the departure phase. Change is underway. Michael leaves the departure phase when he rushes to his father's side in hospital and thwarts a second assassination attempt. Importantly, he finds the experience exhilarating, not terrifying. Michael then conceives of a plan to kill Captain McCluskey and Salazzo, the drug baron who's behind the hit on his father. We're off to the races. In Act 3, we have the long initiation phase, where the now committed hero experiments with testing the problem, gaining ever more knowledge, failing here and there along the way, until, through his struggles, the hero uncovers key knowledge of the problem, usually finding that knowledge at their own personal worst point. This is the meat of the story. In The Godfather, it's Michael's personal execution of his plan, key knowledge about himself, and his necessary fleeing to Sicily afterwards. It's the escalation of the conflict between the 5 mafia families back home in New York. It's the murder of his brother Sonny, the incredible James Caan, followed shortly thereafter by the killing of Michael's new wife in Sicily in a car bomb that was intended for Michael. Now, the hero experiments with this key knowledge before, in Act 4, gaining full knowledge of the problem. The hero faces the consequences of that newfound knowledge. It's Michael, having paid the price of losing Sonny and his wife, returning to New York. It's his father warning him about a traitor in their midst before dying peacefully in his garden. For Michael, there can be no return to a normal life. He must fully become the Godfather. In Act 5, the return phase, the hero returns to face a final choice about applying the newfound knowledge in their real life, and they must do so successfully before ultimately attaining mastery of the problem and being changed by what they have learned. It's Michael learning that at his father's funeral, that the trusted family friend Tessio is the traitor, and then going on to later kill the shit out of basically everyone who opposes him, thus cementing his position as head of the family. Michael has changed from being totally disconnected to the family business to running the family business. All is changed. You might at this point want to point out that the journey from war hero to master criminal doesn't sound that heroic, but The Godfather is a particular type of story known as a dark inversion, so the direction of growth is actually morally reversed. So the summary of all of that is, hero starts zone of comfort, lacks knowledge, that throws up a problem, don't want to deal with it, forced to experiment with it, which is challenging and uncomfortable, but that's what heroes do. So they gain knowledge of how it works, and then they apply that and ultimately achieve mastery, being changed then by what they have learned, which could all be summarized down to, they learned what they needed to learn. Can I be nerdy and just call that information processing again? Depart as dumbass, initiate some experiments, return knowing how the world works. Departure, initiation, return. building maps of cause and effect along the way to forge an identity. Change is constant. Be a hero. Learn how to learn. So that's part 2. A hero on a journey. It's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, our identity, the answer to the question, who am I? Evolution has repurposed the tool of story, which was initially useful in helping us process and learn about the physical world around us, in order to now help us to build a story of personal identity that will allow us to operate in a social world. By setting us up as the hero in our own story, allowing us to construct a useful story to answer the question, who am I? Who am I? I am the sum total of the stories I have told myself about the experiences I have had. Ideally, I am willing to learn and change. Our 2 levels of story for today. In part 1, with surprise in mind, we discussed the stories that create our basic perception of cause and effect in the physical world around us. We talked about evolution, film editing, dopamine, and information theory. Then in part 2, A Hero on a Journey, we discussed the story that creates our perception of ourselves and our identities as heroes, and how a key trait of heroes is the willingness to learn and to change. Reuse, recycle, repurpose. Evolution doesn't like waste. Each time the same tool with the same basic shape used over and over again. Story. Again and again, we see aspects of our nature and our psychology surfaced in the stories that we tell. Canadian communication theorist Marshall McLuhan is famous for saying, "The medium is the message." He considered that the medium of communication was not neutral to the message, but rather shaped it. For him, the message was something that changed the scale or pace or pattern of human affairs. He could have been talking about the human brain and the stories that we use it to tell. If you look past the superficial specifics of any given story to see the underlying structure, you will often see that it reveals the lessons that we as humans constantly need reminding of. Pay attention. Change is constant. We don't all see the world perfectly. Heroes learn and change, they adapt, they evolve. Even in the face of massive opposition, they never give up. We do not exist in isolation, we exist in relationship with others. When we find our treasures, we must share them. We said earlier, the stories are our software. That is true. They give us abilities no animals had before. We have access to simulations of worlds we have never experienced firsthand, and yet our physiology will react to those stories as if they are real at a profound level. So much so that specific details, sensation-based verbs, even the structure of grammar used in stories will all draw our attention and make our brains fire neurons almost as if they were dealing with reality. Stories offer us low-risk trips to other models of the world, new maps. Stories are a unique weapon that humans have in the battle of evolution. They give us the gift of seeing how your models for the world might be wrong, so you can update your software and become more effective in the world. It's entirely possible for Tom in the office to be a stellar employee, like milking his coffee, just like you, and be an axe-wielding maniac. That story might be worth considering in some circumstances. These simulations can be used to allow us to explore the same problems from multiple different viewpoints, showing us options we never knew we had. It's the raw power of remembering that you can pull a door open instead of pushing it. No joke. It's easy to forget that. Another benefit to consider is that normally in nature, the natural selection of evolution benefits groups, not individuals. Good news for groups, bad news for individuals. Unfit individuals dying is the price paid for a fitter group. But stories give human individuals the ability to become our own populations, to allow our internally weak beliefs, habits, and ideas to die, and to select for better ones, to allow natural selection to work inside of the individual and evolve them many times over from the inside out within the span of one lifetime. Now, it's not easy. You got to struggle and pay a price for it, but With stories, we have the power to let bad beliefs die and foster new, better ones, if we are willing to do the hard work to change. And sure, isn't that what heroes do? Our stories also allow us to cooperate and coordinate, to share a view of reality and agree on what it is that needs to be done. We're not the physically strongest animal. Without technology and alone, we're easy prey for many species, but our ability to cooperate and plan is one of our superpowers. Stories, as we have learned, are not just trilogy George Lucas movies about young space samurais finding their fathers in space. They're not just trilogy Francis Ford Coppola movies about young godfathers replacing their fathers as godfathers. Nor are they 5 die-hard movies about a father who cannot trust infrastructure. Yes, they are those things, but they are not just those things. Stories, in fact, are evolution's ultimate weapon. Evolution gave us stories, and once it discovered their power, it used them as much as possible. First, in the basic perception of cause and effect in the physical world around us, then in the perception of ourselves, informing our identities. Lastly, in our perception of other humans, which, as we said, we haven't covered today, but we will discuss when we revisit this topic in future episodes, if you guys let me know that you're interested in that. Reuse, recycle, repurpose. The same tool with the same basic shape, and that tool, you guessed it, is story. So do try to tell your stories well, because if you're not doing that right now, just know that you do have the freedom to tell yourself a different story at any time. Stories have power. They can process reality, create identities, and they can even help us cheat death. Our stories are tools for transferring our mental models across generations. It is through our children and our stories that we live into the future. 77 years ago, and I've remembered it perfectly. I went back and saw him that night. He sat in the chair with his sword. They pulled a switch and his hair stood up. He reached out with his sword and touched everyone in the front row, boys and girls, men and women, with the electricity that sizzled from his sword. When he came to me, he touched me on the brow, on the nose, on the chin, and he said to me in a whisper, "Live forever." And I decided to. Mr. Electrico knew the score. Next episode, we'll be taking a look at what happens to our story of identity when it goes out into the big bad world and meets with disapproval. We'll talk about self-confidence, self-esteem, identity, shame, chess, and wrestling, because fuck it, why not? Last time around, we left on a music recommendation, so I thought we'd do the same again. This one is nice and obscure. It's from a Scottish singer called Jackie Levin. Got thrown up on Spotify during the week, and it's been stuck in my head. I love it. And it's got an amazing title too. It's called, get this, The Sexual Loneliness of Jesus Christ. Trust me, the song is just, it won't get out of your fucking head, man. Enjoy. Check it out on Spotify, check it out with whatever the hell you listen to songs on. And yeah, let me know what you think. Alright guys, have a good one. Good luck. See you next time.